A few of my friends finally started using Claude Code, and I've noticed that because of a few influencers, they've just installed a bunch of skills, a bunch of MCPs, as if they really need those tools in order to have Claude Code work effectively. And honestly, they and probably you don't need most of the things that you have installed. So that's why in this video, I'll go through my workflow in building with Claude Code. Now, before moving forward, this is the type of app that I build. And I think it's important to show this off just to point out what type of things that you can build with my workflow. Since honestly, to build something like just a landing page, you really don't need to overthink this and you probably won't use most of these features. All right, let's get straight to it. First off is auto mode. Now, auto mode is something that everyone should be using instead of dangerously skip permissions. Whoever's more familiar with this command, it basically allows Claude to skip the need to ask you permission to delete a file, to update a file, to go inside of a specific folder. Now, the problem with that is some people get their entire databases wiped out just because Claude is acting on its behalf and what it thinks is best to do. And then it'll just go on and act and execute commands that it thinks it needs to without really understanding if it should be doing that. But now if you just run Claude as a Claude command and that opens up, down here you should see auto mode on. If you don't see that, just hold shift and press tab. This will cycle across different modes, and the auto mode on basically is an instruction to Claude that tells it, hey, whenever you need to execute a specific command that will do something possibly risky, like deleting something, updating a folder in another path, or executing database queries, instead of just running it, first have an LLM verify if that command is safe to run. And then only after that validation comes in, then you proceed to execute it. This way you don't have to keep pressing enter to accept every single command, and you also reduce the risk of the LLM just running something you didn't want it to run. Now we can get even deeper into this because some commands aren't enabled by default, but you can activate them manually. Out of the box, the classifier trusts only the working directory and the current repo's configured remotes. Actions like pushing to your company's source control org or writing to a team cloud bucket are blocked until you add them to auto mode environment. This is something you would add to the Claude settings, but honestly, I have never added a further command just because probably the things they enable by default are enough for what I work with. Lastly, if for some reason your auto mode isn't working, open it up like this. So Claude -- enable auto mode, hit enter, and it should already open with the auto mode on. All right, now let's take a look at the dynamic workflows feature. Now, this is an agent orchestrator feature. And if you don't know what that is, it's as simple as a main agent that has the power to summon multi-agents to do whatever task it needs. Now, this is efficient for many different reasons. One of them is that you can multitask. So you could be doing multiple features, accomplishing multiple tasks all at once. Another reason this is great is for context efficiency. Because let's suppose that the AI agent needs recent AI agent news. So because it needs that, it'll probably need to do a full research. And this full research would involve it searching for specific websites, and then maybe it would find website A.com, website B.com, and so and so. Some of these websites wouldn't be useful for us. And maybe while scraping a website, it retrieved an HTML response, which would pollute the context window. So honestly, this is all a lot of noise, and only the output of this, which is the summary of the actual recent AI agent news, is what we want. So instead of having all this in our context window and just polluting the main agent's session, we can instead have the main agent orchestrate a single session of an agent that will have all this context inside of it. And the only thing our main agent will see is the summary and the actual output we need. Now, this is just one example. You can also have multi-agents where this one would be responsible for design. This one down here can be responsible for backend. And then we could have this last one responsible for front end. Now, before I show you this inside of Claude Code, let me alert that this can waste you a lot of tokens. And by the way, sometimes you don't want to use dynamic workflows. So for example, depending on what you want your main agent to do, maybe it would need the context from this search. And then because you needed that context and now it used a dynamic workflow to fetch for it, it doesn't have the context anymore and would likely need to fetch for the same context that it did fetch previously, making the whole process kind of redundant and not that much token efficient. The way I most prefer to use dynamic workflows is selecting the effort as ultra code. The ultra code effort makes Claude Code use the X high effort along with workflows. Now notice that we have X high and then max, and max is the smartest version of the effort feature, not necessarily ultra code. Ultra code is just a combination of the X high, which is not the smartest version, along with workflows. I feel like that's important to say just because I've seen people on Twitter saying that ultra code is the smartest effort when it's not really. One thing I like to use dynamic agents is to do a full code review. Now, this isn't the best prompt for that, but it should be enough to trigger the dynamic workflow and allow us to see all of these agents working. Let me actually add do not code just to report back. All right, so the first thing it'll do is actually understand which agents it needs to trigger. So if you run dash workflows, you might not see anything. And there it is, no dynamic workflows in the session. Let's get out of there. Just hit ESC to get out of that workflows feature. And let's wait a bit until those agents are triggered. All right, so only after it gathers the necessary context, then it'll launch the multi-agent workflow. As soon as the agents start working, you should see this option down here. So when you click it, you can actually track all of those different sessions that the main agent started. So what we're seeing here are these agents. And you can actually toggle around and see what's happening inside of each one of those agents. Just use the arrow keys. So I can go to this specific session, see what's happening in there, see the prompt that was generated for it. And if you don't have this opened up, you can always do a slash workflows and see just these specific windows for the agent workflows. All right, so that's dynamic workflows. It'll grab all the context and act with those bunch of multi-agents. Now let's check agent view. This is really interesting. And instead of you opening a bunch of, so Claude here, and then let's open another Claude instance here, instead of doing all that, which is what I was honestly used to, now I'm using the agents feature. And the agents feature, you can either from inside of Claude just arrow left and be taken to this agent view, or you can just start Claude with Claude agents, which will already open that specific agent view. This is a way for you to run multiple sessions. So I can say something like, "Hi Claude, how are you today?" Hit enter. That starts up a new session. Then I can go back to this new session created previously and say, "Goodbye, Claude." And then once I want to check my previous sessions, I can just arrow left and then just arrow up to find that other chat, click enter to go inside of it, check what's going on, iterate in whatever prompt that it needs, then arrow left, and so on. There's a set of commands that you can use. So for example, if you want to delete that specific session, you could just go over it, hold Control and hit X. That will stop the session, then click X again to delete that specific session. But if you ever forget the command, you don't need to always go to this link. Just do a question mark. You shouldn't see the actual character, but you should see some of the commands down here. The only reason I wasn't using agent view for a long time was because of the work tree. To make sure that one session isn't interfering with what another session is doing, it often creates different branches of the project and then lists those branches as a work tree folder in here to implement whatever each session needs. And I don't really like that, even because when I'm working with different sessions, none of those sessions will interfere in what the other session is doing. And I do that because, well, testing is a huge part of agentic coding, and it just doesn't feel right to me that I'll have to go through all of these different branches to test a feature that is not built along with the other feature. And I don't know, it just doesn't make sense. It feels too vibe codish for me. And I much prefer to use this command that guarantees that the isolation is not done and that all of the features from every sessions are all done in the same branch. And if you want to do that as well, all you have to do is add these lines inside of your settings.json from inside of the .claude folder. Speaking of which, let's check the CLI settings. By CLI settings, I mean this. With this, you can see exactly the model that you're using, which project you're working on, what is the branch, how much of the context window has been used up, and how much this would have cost. So I'm using the Claude plan, so it's not really charging me anything, but showing me how much it would have cost if I were using the API instead. Finally, this shows the time that you've spent in this specific session. To have this below each one of your sessions, it's really simple. All you'll want to do is add these lines inside of your settings.json. This part is actually to make Claude full screen. If you haven't noticed, even if I drag my terminal up, Claude Code is on full screen mode. And this really helps to avoid things like flickering when Claude is running a bunch of things and you just see all of those characters just popping off and on of your terminal. And then we have the status line. Now, status line needs the status line.sh file, which will be in the description of the video. But after you add it, you still need to use one more command, which is this one right here. You just need to open up a terminal, type that in, hit enter, and you should be good to go. So that's basically it. Have the status line.sh file inside of the .claude folder, and inside of settings.json, have these lines that will indicate where the status line.sh file is. And I really do recommend that you have this line to make Claude Code occupy the full space of your terminal. All right, so now we're done with Claude settings. Let's take a look at the Claude in Chrome. This is a really cool feature. I know that I've said that all of these are cool features, but this one is really efficient for you to verify end to end in a sense where you might have ran into issues where you're seeing what's going wrong in your app, but you can't really express that over to Claude since it doesn't have eyes inside of your website to see exactly what's going on. It can see code, it can predict kind of what's going to happen, but visually, what's going on might be different from what Claude has expected. And then often we would just take a screenshot, send it over to Claude, and expect it to apply the code. Then we look at it, maybe it's not exactly what we were expecting. So then we take a screenshot again, send it over to Claude. So the end-to-end logic here is allowing Claude to do that on its own. An example I can use for my app is that when I put it in light mode, I've noticed that there's a huge chunk that just doesn't follow up with it being in light mode. Now, this isn't the best example because I think Claude could solve this without really looking at the app, but I will use the feature just to show you how Claude can actually open up the website and look to see if its fixes actually were applied. The first thing you'll want to do is /Chrome, and this will allow you to check if the status is enabled and if the extension is installed. This extension, you can find it up here. So there it is. You can log into it. You should log into it. And after you do, you basically have an extension that gives Claude access to whatever you're seeing in your Chrome browser. Now I can toggle it to be enabled by default, but that's not really what I'm going for. So instead, I can run Claude --Chrome. After you do that, you should see back in your Chrome that a Claude instance of that tab was opened. Go back to your terminal, hit enter, and now inside of this Claude session, it can communicate with the browser and take screenshots to see exactly the same as us. My prompt is in the product tour session, it isn't getting light mode. It just stays dark mode. So use Claude in Chrome to check it out. When I send that prompt, and by the way, since this is managed from Claude, avoid scrolling down, clicking anywhere because Claude is actually trying to perform actions inside of the website. So you'll see that it will scroll down. And if you change anything that it did, it will just mess up its prompting and you might not get the desired result. Okay, so it didn't realize it already had a session working. So let me just select this and it already went directly to that session. It didn't really scroll down just because it didn't need to, as it read my code, understood that there was this ID. So it just needed to access exactly that to be taken to this area. As you can see, it's toggling from light mode to dark mode and back to really get full context of what's going on. Now that it provided the possible fix, I'll just say go on and fix it. All right, now it seems to work pretty fine in light mode. And an important thing to mention is most of the times you still should just take a screenshot and send only that screenshot as a context to Claude Code, just because using the many commands inside of the browser does take up a lot of tokens and is also just a slower workflow. All right, awesome. We're done with Claude and Chrome. Now let's take a fast look at skills. I won't go into detail about this, but it's an important thing to mention because I've been actually seeing people sell skills. That's kind of absurd because It's of interest of companies like, for example, I have Stripe here. These skills were built from Stripe, and it's of their interest to build skills like this because then I can import it into my project and use the Stripe features. But when you find skills for a Next.js project, for example, it doesn't make a lot of sense since each project is kind of unique. I mean, maybe if you're building a landing page, most of them have a specific structure, and you can ideally have a skill that you could follow. But honestly, if you're not just building a project you'll throw away 2 days later, you'll really want to guide the agent into building something really useful. Therefore, what I do is have an app overview and app guideline skill that these will immediately tell the agent what the app is about. Because if I don't do that, every single time I tell Claude to do anything related to implementing a specific feature, it might forget that it needs to fix it in another part of the app. And this is actually a problem for a bit more complex apps that has many different parts. For example, my app has an interface for adding competitors. I can also create different projects. These projects can be created based on a video, and all this is accessible through an MCP as well. So, for example, I change the way that timestamps are generated for the app and for the tooling of the app. Then I have to remember to change it inside of the MCP as well. To ensure that I don't mess up and end up forgetting it, I ensure that through this app overview skill, Claude won't let me forget that. Now, somewhere else I think is extremely important to have a skill is for design. Now, mine is inside of app guidelines. So it is always added to the context of Claude Code whenever I open up a session inside of this project. And it's basically about ensuring I have a consistent design throughout all of the pages. Because, for example, whenever it needs to use a loader, you might have noticed that it uses a spinning wheel, and I hate that. I really much prefer skeletons. And because it has that specific skill, when I tell it to create a modal, it already creates it with. Actually, this is really fast. Yeah, there it is. The skeleton shows up neatly, and it understands that I much prefer a skeleton than the spinning wheel without me having to tell it every single time. So from that, hopefully you understood that skills are specific to your project and you should be building those skills alongside your project rather than just getting a generic set of skills that doesn't connect with what you're building. All right, that is it for today. Thanks for watching and I'll see you in the next video. Till then.